Hi, my name is Sarah Masland. I'm an associate professor of psychological science at Pomona College and a licensed clinical psychologist. I specialize in personality disorders and stigma about mental health. Today we're going to be talking about narcissism. This is Office Hours. So the first question is, how do psychologists define narcissism? And this is actually a great question, because although it seems like it should be straightforward, there are some differences of opinion. It helps to start with a key consideration that's often neglected in contemporary public discussions of narcissism, which is that narcissism can be healthy. Narcissism is not inherently pathological. Healthy narcissism is actually the core of self-esteem. It supports relationships with yourself and with other people. And when I say healthy narcissism, I'm referring to a person's ability to regulate their self-esteem, including an appropriately positive sense of self-regard, through healthy means. It also includes things like entitlement, which is another word with largely negative connotations. But healthy narcissism encompasses what I would call normal or functional entitlement and self-preservation. For example, the belief that you deserve to be treated fairly, or the ability to set boundaries in healthy relationships. However, narcissism does exist on a spectrum or continuum from healthy to pathological. On one end, we have this healthy narcissism, or the effective regulation of self-esteem. At the other end, pathological narcissism refers to a dysregulation in self-esteem. It's a regulation process rather than a static condition. Now, self-esteem could be dysregulated in a number of different ways. In pathological narcissism specifically, we see that people have both grandiosity and vulnerability. Although they may appear outwardly grandiose, they have a fragile sense of self with significant vulnerability. They also have difficulty accepting and regulating emotions like anger, shame, envy, guilt. We see that they attempt to avoid feeling inferior or vulnerable through actions or behaviors that support the grandiose presentation, which is fragile, and that are often damaging to relationships and relationship partners. They overinvest in strategies like seeking validation or praise from other people. Pathological narcissism is problematic, but it's not necessarily the same thing as what we call narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. This diagnosis is reserved for situations where pathological narcissism is severe, occurs across situations or contexts, and is also enduring across time. There's growing consensus that the official diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder is itself problematic and needs revision, and it is likely to change in the next edition of the diagnostic manual that the field relies upon. So the next question is, how does narcissism develop? Are people born with it, or does it form through life experiences? As with most aspects of personality, the answer is both. It's rarely as simple in psychology as nature versus nurture. The two interact and influence one another. Some aspects of pathological narcissism may be inherited, including hypersensitivity, interpersonal hypersensitivity in particular, and difficulties with frustration tolerance and emotion regulation, particularly with anger. These difficulties may be inherited genetically and then ingrained through socialization, which occurs primarily through interactions with parents who themselves may have similar difficulties. And there are two primary theories about how pathological narcissism is socialized. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In one theory, parents are overindulgent and overpraising. They put the child on a pedestal. And the other theory, parents are cold, indifferent, or authoritarian. Their praise or regard may be perceived as conditional. It's earned through success, performance, or meeting often impossible expectations. In either case, children may become dependent on external validation to regulate their self-esteem and to guard against vulnerability and defend a sense of grandiosity. So the next question is, has social media made narcissism more common or just more visible? I love this question because it's something we're pursuing answers to in my research lab here at Pomona College. And it's probably both, but more of the latter. Even with the proliferation of social media, very young children do not typically have access. And we know that the developmental roots of narcissism begin at an early age. Children as young as 2 or 3 can start to understand and articulate their attributes. They may say things like, I can swim, although what we would recognize as global self-esteem emerges later, probably around age 8. In other words, the gears are already in motion for developing narcissism when people post their first Insta. Does social media alter the trajectory of narcissism? That's still an open empirical question. We do know that grandiosity is related to social media use. So people who score higher in grandiosity may be more frequently posting on social media, for example. Although this average effect or association is small across studies, and we can't be sure of the causal pathways. Does grandiosity lead to more posts on social media, or does interacting with social media actually lead to greater grandiosity? The direction of the cause is something that's not clear. There's also evidence of significant cultural differences in the association between narcissism and social media use that are actually not well studied. Keep in mind that this is a young area of research because social media itself is not that old. The first study in this area was published in 2008. It's important to remember also that people with pathological narcissism will find external validation even in the absence of social media, as they have done through the ages. I've probably worked with more people with pathological narcissism who do not have social media accounts at all than those who have a significant presence on social media. However, social media definitely provides a platform for seeking external validation and for witnessing the lengths that people will go to for likes and comments. Social media has also provided a platform for discussion of narcissism, which has most definitely proliferated in the past 5 to 10 years. Public discussion of narcissism is much more common in the social media era. Overall, I think there are many reasons to be cautious with social media, but it's also important to remember that there is such a thing as healthy narcissism, and there are probably ways that we can use social media to regulate self-esteem in healthy ways too. It's not always pathological to seek some external validation, celebrate your accomplishments, or even brag a bit. It's the overinvestment in this regulation strategy that becomes problematic. So the next question is, what misconceptions about narcissism do you wish the public better understood? So talk about narcissism is everywhere, and there's significant concept creep. What I mean by that is that the term narcissism is now being used to refer to a whole range of personality traits and interpersonal difficulties that probably are not truly narcissism. For example, behaviors that are more consistent with other personality problems, including but not limited to sociopathy or psychopathy, or even things like obsessive personality problems, are often labeled as narcissism. I'd like the public to know that our words and labels matter and that this concept creep is not actually helpful. It's not helpful in large part because it often comes hand in hand with views that are limiting and sometimes stigmatizing. Most of the content I see on social media, for example, focuses exclusively on ways that people with pathological narcissism harm other people. I see catchy titles like "How to Beat a Narcissist at Their Own Game." And I understand why people focus on the negative effects that pathological narcissism has on other people. And I would never deny or downplay those effects. I want to be very clear about that. When I talk about destigmatizing anything, or about being more precise with our labels, I do not mean for destigmatization to give permission for problematic behaviors. It also is not a call to accept pathological narcissism and allow it to continue as is. Destigmatization, accountability, and change are not at odds with one another. And in fact, I would argue that destigmatization is a key to change. Here's the central issue. I think everyone would agree that we want to change pathological narcissism. If we want people with pathological narcissism to seek treatment and to find ways to interact with others in healthy, mutually beneficial ways, then we have to change this conversation. Blaming all of society's problems on narcissism, calling people out as narcissists, painting narcissists as completely bad, and recognizing only the grandiose component of narcissism will only make people more reluctant to seek help and accept a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder when it's appropriate. It also excludes many people whose narcissism presents in more subtle and less interpersonally harmful ways. Narcissism is actually incredibly complex and presents in a number of different ways. We need to be more precise about what narcissism is and is not, and we need to recognize the self-esteem dysregulation and the underlying vulnerability that drives problematic behaviors. It's that vulnerability that's a gateway to change. So the next question is, why does stigma around mental health persist, even with growing awareness? This is complex for sure, and the answer is probably similar for many of the isms. Why do racism, sexism, ableism, ageism persist, even in a world with growing awareness and intergroup contact? I wish I had a definitive answer. And this is no excuse for it, but people have many incentives, societal and evolutionary, to categorize, create hierarchies, and oversimplify what we don't understand. There's been fabulous and impactful work over the past decades to bring awareness to stigma and to change it, but we operate under the weight of societal structures that make stigmas effective tools for minoritizing other people or gaining or maintaining status. I'm not a politics professor, but I think we need to recognize that the personal is political. Still, resistance is effective. Even in the past 10 years, I have seen seismic shifts in the conversation around mental health.